He called her replaceable, not in private, not in a whispered cruelty meant only for her ears. He said it at the boardroom table in Chicago, surrounded by 12 colleagues who had watched Amani Brooks build that company's Asia-Pacific strategy from a single PowerPoint deck into a $40 million operation. Her ex-husband, David Brooks, CFO, golf buddy to half the room, and the man she had loved for 11 years, leaned back in his chair, looked her dead in the eye, and said, "Honestly, anyone competent could have done what she did. The market did the heavy lifting." Nobody corrected him. Nobody pushed back. Two people looked at their phones. One man refilled his coffee. That was the moment Amani stopped believing that the life she had built with David was ever really hers. If you have ever poured everything you had into a person, your ambition, your late nights, your willingness to shrink yourself just a little so they could feel taller, and then watch them look straight through you like you were furniture, then you already know what Amani felt walking out of that room. And if you have ever had to decide, in the wreckage of something you thought would last forever, whether to go home and start over or disappear somewhere new and rebuild from nothing, then this story is going to sit with you. Stay until the end. What happens next will surprise you. And if this story finds you tonight, do me a favor. Hit that like button, drop your city or country in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Now, let's go back to Seoul. The cafe was called Bora, small place, second floor of a building on a narrow street in Yeonam-dong, the kind of neighborhood that still had real trees growing through cracked sidewalks and laundry lines between windows. Amani had found it 14 months ago during a thunderstorm when every other option involved a queue and a barista who would mispronounce her order. She had climbed the stairs mostly to get dry, ordered an Americano out of habit, and sat down at the corner table by the window. She had come back every morning since. It was not sentiment. Amani did not do sentiment, not anymore. It was logistics. The corner table had good light, reliable Wi-Fi, and enough ambient noise to keep her focused without crossing into distraction. The staff knew her order. Nobody tried to make conversation. In a city of 11 million people, this one table at 7:45 in the morning was the closest thing she had to a controlled environment, and after the last 3 years of her life, controlled environments were non-negotiable. She was 43 years old. She had been divorced for 19 months. She was, by every measurable professional standard, thriving. That last part was the one she kept returning to on mornings when thriving felt like a performance she was too tired to rehearse. Her laptop was open, her Americano was half gone, and she was 40 minutes into a competitive analysis for a Seoul-based logistics company that was bleeding market share to 3 younger competitors. The work was clean, it was solvable. Numbers did not gaslight you. Spreadsheets did not spend 11 years quietly collecting evidence of your inadequacy and then deploy it during a Tuesday morning meeting. She scrolled to the next tab and did not look up when the cafe door opened. The chair at the table beside her scraped against the floor. Someone sat down. She registered it the way you register weather: present, irrelevant, requiring no response. Then the coffee hit her laptop. Not a drip, not a splash. A full cup, dark and hot, spreading across the keyboard in the particular unhurried way that disasters always move right before the damage becomes irreversible. Amani's hand shot out on reflex and grabbed the machine off the table, tilting it to drain, already calculating. Backup drive, last sync, which tabs she had closed without saving, how much of the morning was salvageable. "I'm sorry." The voice was low and immediate. Korean accent, English words, no panic in the delivery, just a directness that cut through her own internal noise. "That was entirely my fault." She looked up. The man was already standing, a fistful of paper napkins in one hand, his own jacket off his arm, and pressed against the edge of the table where the coffee was still running. He was not hovering. He was not performing distress. He was just handling it. Quietly, efficiently, like someone accustomed to problems that required an immediate response and no wasted motion. He was younger than she expected from the voice. Early 30s, maybe, dark suit, no tie, the kind of posture that did not come from trying. His face was composed in a way that was not cold, just settled, like he had already decided how this moment was going to go, and the decision had cost him nothing. "The laptop," he said. "Is it damaged?" Amani turned it over in her hands. The screen had gone dark. Her stomach dropped approximately 3 floors. "I don't know yet." "May I?" He held out his hand, not reaching, just offering. She had no particular reason to hand her laptop to a stranger. She handed him the laptop. He turned it carefully, examined the ports, tilted it at an angle she hadn't tried, and then set it flat on the table with the screen facing down. "It needs to dry before you try to restart it. 20 minutes minimum." He looked at her directly. "I'm sorry. I can replace it if it doesn't recover." "You don't need to do that." "I know." He said it without any particular weight, like the difference between need and intention was obvious. "But the coffee was mine and the table was too small and I should have been paying attention. So I will, if it comes to that." Amani looked at him for a moment longer than she meant to. There was something in his manner that she couldn't quite locate. Not charm, exactly. Something quieter than charm. Charm pushed. This was different. This was the absence of push. "Imani Brooks," she said. "Kang Jun-ha." He gestured toward the napkins he'd used. "Do you want more coffee while you wait?" "I want my morning back." "I can't give you that." He said it without apology, just honesty. "But I can get the coffee." She almost smiled. She didn't, but it was close. He ordered for her, correctly, without asking, because he had apparently heard her order when he came in. "Americano, no sugar, medium cup." He came back with 2 of them and set hers on the undamaged side of the table and his own on the seat across from her, and then he asked, with the same directness he'd used on everything else, whether she minded if he worked here while she waited. She minded, technically. This was her table, her morning, her controlled environment, and the variables had already been significantly disrupted. But the laptop was still drying and she had nothing else to do for the next 18 minutes, and something about the way he asked, not assuming, not performing politeness, just genuinely checking, made her say, "Fine." He opened a leather portfolio. Not a laptop. An actual physical notebook and a very precise pen. He wrote in Korean, dense and fast, and he did not speak to her. After 6 minutes, she realized she had been watching him without meaning to. After 9 minutes, she tried the laptop. The screen came on. The files were intact. The competitive analysis was exactly where she had left it. "It's fine," she said. He looked up. "Good." And then without any transition. "What do you do? Corporate strategy consulting? Seoul client base?" "Primarily. Some Tokyo, some Singapore." He nodded slowly. "You moved here for the work or after?" She paused. It was too specific a question for a stranger, but it was also accurate. The distinction between moving somewhere for a reason and moving somewhere after a reason had ended was not a distinction most people made. "After," she said. He did not ask after what. He just nodded, like the answer was sufficient, and went back to his notebook. That was when she first understood that Kang Jun-ha was not going to be easy to categorize. She left at 9:15, which was 40 minutes later than her usual departure. She noticed this on the stairs and filed it away without analysis. The day proceeded normally. She had a 2-hour call with the logistics company's regional director, a working lunch with a finance executive she was helping transition from corporate life into independent consulting, and a late afternoon review of a contract proposal that she ultimately recommended her client decline. Politely, specifically, with 3 pages of supporting rationale. It was good work. Clean work. At 7 in the evening, she was back in her apartment, a quiet 2-bedroom on the 14th floor of a building in Mapo-gu. She had furnished it slowly and deliberately, one piece at a time, choosing things that were hers in a way that the Chicago condo had never quite been. David had been particular about aesthetics. Amani's taste, apparently, had been too much, too bold, too present. Her Seoul apartment was full of color. She made dinner, checked her email, and did not think about the man at the cafe. Except that she did, once, briefly, when she set her coffee cup down on the wrong side of the counter and had to move it. 3 mornings later, she came down from the 2nd floor of Bora, and he was already there. Not at her table. He had taken the one by the opposite window, same leather portfolio, same pen, same composed stillness. He looked up when she came in. He did not wave or call out or do anything that would require her to acknowledge him. She sat at her table, ordered her coffee, opened her laptop. After 12 minutes, without looking up from her screen, she said, "You work early." "The morning is quieter," he said. "What do you do?" "Investment," he said. "Primarily acquisition." "What kind?" "Companies in transition." He paused. "The ones people have given up on or haven't noticed yet." She looked at him then. "Turnaround work?" "Sometimes. Sometimes I hold them. Sometimes I rebuild from the structure up." She turned that over. "What tells you which one?" He considered the question seriously, the way she had noticed he considered everything. Without performance, just actual thought. "The people still inside it," he said. "Whether they still care or whether they're just waiting to leave." It was a good answer. She turned back to her screen. 20 minutes later, she said Imani Brooks, even though they had already done this. "I remember," he said. "I wasn't sure. I remember things that matter." She should have found that presumptuous. She found it instead surprisingly exact. The mornings accumulated. Not every morning. He wasn't always there, and when he wasn't, she didn't find it significant or told herself she didn't, but often enough that the corner table and the window table developed a loose geography between them, a kind of acknowledged proximity that didn't require explanation. He never moved to her table uninvited. She never moved to his. They talked across the distance between them, occasionally about work things, market positioning, risk assessment, the particular difficulty of operating in Korean business culture as an outsider. He listened to her the way very few people listened, without waiting for his turn to speak, without formatting her words into the shape of his own experience. She began to look forward to the mornings when he was there. She did not tell anyone this, because there was no one to tell, which was its own kind of answer. The first time she saw the other side of him was a Tuesday, 6 weeks after the coffee spill. She was there before him, already an hour into a proposal draft, when the cafe door opened and Jun-ha came in. She registered him the way she always did now, peripheral, familiar, and was already looking back at her screen when she noticed that the room had changed. It took her a second to identify what changed. Not noise, actually the opposite. The ambient conversation had dimmed by a fraction, the way it does when someone walks in who carries authority that precedes them. The barista, a young man who always moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who had mastered his small domain, had straightened slightly. 2 men at a table near the door. Businessmen, mid-40s, thick business cards, and conservative suits, had followed Junha's entry with a sustained attention that was not casual. One of them stood up. Imani watched from her corner table as the man crossed the room, inclined his head in a gesture that was close to a bow without quite reaching one, and spoke to Junha in a low voice. She couldn't hear the words. What she could read, clearly and without ambiguity, was the quality of the exchange. The businessman was not greeting an equal. His posture said something specific: deference, caution, the careful management of an encounter with someone above him. Junha spoke briefly. His expression did not change. The businessman returned to his table. Junha ordered his coffee, came upstairs, sat at the window table, opened his portfolio. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," Imani said. She did not ask about the man at the door. She went back to her proposal. But the image stayed with her. The way the room had reorganized itself around his entry, without theater, without anyone being asked. She knew what deference looked like. She had spent 2 decades in corporate environments where authority and social position were constantly, exhaustingly performed. What she had just seen was different. It was not performed. It was received. The distinction mattered. She didn't know yet why. The dinner invitation came on a Wednesday. They had talked that morning longer than usual. A 40-minute stretch about a retail restructuring she was advising on, which had triggered an unexpectedly specific back and forth about inventory management in Korean logistics chains. He had pulled a number from memory that she had to look up to verify, And it was exactly right, which annoyed her mildly and impressed her significantly. When she was packing up to leave, he said, without preamble, "Have dinner with me." She stopped packing. As what? As what? As a business dinner? A friendly dinner? Or something else? He did not look away. Something else. She had not dated anyone since David, had not wanted to, had not tried to, had made the conscious decision that the entire project of allowing another person close enough to matter was something she was deferring indefinitely. She was good at deferring things. It was a professional skill. "You're younger than me," she said. "By about 10 years, he said. "If that's relevant to you." "I don't know yet." "That's a fair answer." She picked up her bag. "I'll think about it." "Take your time," he said, and she believed he meant it. She said yes 4 days later, not because she had finished thinking, but because she realized she was never going to finish thinking, and at some point you had to make a decision with the information available. The restaurant he chose was not what she expected. She had prepared herself for something spectacular, the kind of evening that wealthy Korean businessmen apparently choreographed as a statement of intent, a performance of what they could provide. She had her guard constructed accordingly. She was ready to be unimpressed. The place was a mid-sized Korean restaurant in a part of Hongdae she had never been to, family-run by the look of it, crowded enough to feel real. He had reserved a table, not a private room. The menu was handwritten. The banchan came in mismatched ceramics. "You could have taken me somewhere expensive," she said, after the first round of food arrived. "I could have," he agreed. "Why didn't you?" He picked up his chopsticks, considered the table, looked at her. "Because expensive is easy. Anyone with money can be expensive. I wanted you to be comfortable, not impressed." She sat with that. "What makes you think there's a difference?" "There isn't, for some people." His tone was not unkind. "But you've been in rooms that were built to impress. I've seen how you look in those rooms, like you're already calculating the exit." It was so accurate that she almost laughed. "You've been watching me. You sit in a corner every morning and observe everything in the room," he said. "It's not surveillance, it's mutual awareness." The dinner lasted 3 hours. They talked about things she had not talked about in years. Her years in Chicago before the move, what she had believed her life would look like at 43, what Seoul had given her that she hadn't expected. He listened the way he always listened, completely, without agenda. And when he spoke about himself, it was carefully, but not evasively, like a man who had decided what was appropriate for right now and would not be pushed past it, but was also not hiding for the sake of hiding. He told her he had grown up watching his father run an organization he'd inherited too young and understood too late. He did not specify what organization. She did not ask. She was not ready for that answer, and somewhere beneath the question, she understood that the answer, when it came, was going to require her to be steadier than she was right now, in this restaurant, 3 glasses of wine into the best evening she'd had in 3 years. When they said goodnight on the street outside, he did not try to prolong it. He said simply that he had enjoyed the evening. "Me too," she said. He nodded. "Same time tomorrow at Bora?" "Same time." She walked to the subway and did not let herself look back, though she was aware, without looking, that he stood there until she was out of sight. What she did not know, what she had no way of knowing, standing on that street in Hongdae with 3 hours of the best conversation she'd had in years still warm in her chest, was that the man she had just eaten dinner with had, 4 hours before their reservation, received a formal threat from the head of a rival criminal organization operating out of Busan. She did not know that 2 of the quiet men who had been seated at separate tables throughout their dinner were his, positioned there as a matter of routine. She did not know that when Kang Junha said he had grown up watching his father run an organization he'd inherited too young, the organization in question controlled 7 legitimate corporations, 3 informal financial networks, and the loyalty of enough people in Korean government and law enforcement to make the word untouchable functionally accurate. She did not know that his name, spoken in certain circles, produced the same effect as that Tuesday morning in the cafe: the straightening spine, the careful words, the instinct not to hold eye contact too long. She knew only what she had seen. A man who returned library books on time, who remembered her coffee order, who looked at her like she was the most interesting problem in the room and had no interest in solving her, only in understanding. It was the most dangerous thing about him. And she was already in it. The morning after the dinner, Amani arrived at Bora 4 minutes later than usual. She would not have noticed, except that she noticed everything about her own routines, because routines were the architecture of a life she had rebuilt with intention, and 4 minutes was not nothing. 4 minutes meant she had stood in front of her closet longer than necessary. 4 minutes meant she had checked her phone twice on the walk over without any particular reason to check it. She sat down at her corner table and ordered her coffee and opened her laptop and did not look at the window table. He wasn't there yet. She worked for 11 minutes before the door opened, and she felt the shift in her own attention before she consciously registered the sound, the way her focus narrowed and then expanded, tuning involuntarily to the room. He came up the stairs, saw her, gave a single nod, not a smile, not a performance, just acknowledgement, clean and direct, the same way he did everything. He ordered. He sat. He opened his portfolio. For 20 minutes they worked in silence, and it was the most comfortable 20 minutes she had experienced in recent memory, which told her something she wasn't ready to name. "You were quiet last night," he said eventually, without looking up. "At the end." "I was thinking." "About?" She looked across the room at him. "About whether I'm making an error in judgment." He set down his pen. "About me." "About the situation." "What specifically concerns you about the situation?" She appreciated that he didn't deflect into reassurance. She had been with a man who defaulted to reassurance whenever she raised a concern. Smooth, reflexive, immediately followed by evidence that the concern had never been actually heard. "You're younger than me," she said. "You're Korean. I'm a Black American woman who has spent 6 years building a professional reputation in a city where I am already a very visible anomaly. I have clients who make decisions about me based on optics I can't always control. Those are real concerns. I know they're real. That's why I'm saying them." "What do you want from me when you say them?" She paused. "I want to know if you've thought about them." "I have," he said. "I can't resolve them for you. I can tell you that I am not someone who makes a decision to pursue someone and then leaves them exposed to consequences I'm unwilling to share." He picked up his pen again. "Beyond that, you're the one who has to decide what you can carry." It was not romantic. It was not comforting in any conventional way. It was honest, and honesty, she had learned in the last 3 years, was rarer and more valuable than comfort. She turned back to her screen. "Fair enough." He went back to his notebook. The morning continued. At one point, she asked him a question about Korean corporate inheritance law for a client brief, and he answered with the specificity of someone who had navigated it personally, which she filed away. At another point, he stood to get a second coffee and brought hers without asking, which she also filed away. When she left at 9:20, she said, "Same time tomorrow." "Same time," he said. She was halfway down the stairs when he called after her, not loudly. "Amani!" She stopped. "The concerns you named," he said. "I've thought about them longer than you have." She didn't answer. She went down the stairs and out into the street and stood in the March cold for a moment before she started walking, and she thought about what it meant that a man she had known for 6 weeks had apparently been thinking longer and harder about her professional exposure than the man she had been married to for 11 years had ever thought about anything outside his own career. It was a small thing. It landed heavily. The first sign of trouble came not from Junha, but from a client. Park Sung-won was a 61-year-old manufacturing executive who had been one of Imani's first Seoul clients, the man who had referred her to 3 others, which had effectively built the first layer of her Korean client network. He was methodical, conservative, and had a habit of prefacing criticism with elaborate courtesy, which meant that when he said during their Thursday meeting, "I wonder if perhaps your schedule has become complicated recently," she understood immediately that he was not talking about her schedule. "My schedule is fine," she said. "Of course." He adjusted his teacup. "It's only that you were seen recently at a restaurant in Hongdae with someone." She kept her expression neutral with the particular discipline of a woman who had learned to manage her face in rooms that did not want her there. "I have dinner with people regularly." Of course, this was noticed, He paused carefully. The person you were with, he has a certain visibility in certain circles. What circles? Park set his teacup down. He was not a man who frightened easily. The way he arranged his hands on the table told her he was choosing words with genuine care. There are names in this city, Ms. Brooks, that function differently from other names. Not because of what the person has built publicly, because of what they are understood to control privately. He met her eyes. I say this with respect, because I respect you. Because you have worked very hard to build something here, and I would not want to see that work complicated. Amani held the silence for 3 full seconds before she responded. Thank you for telling me, she said. Her voice was even. Is there anything else you'd like to discuss about the restructuring plan? Park looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, and they went back to the proposal, and neither of them mentioned it again. But she sat with it the whole subway ride home. The word complicated, the way he had said privately, the way the man at the cafe door had stood up, the way the room reorganized. She had been carrying a low-level awareness of something unresolved in Junha's edges, the way you carry awareness of a structural sound in a building, not alarming enough to act on, persistent enough to note. Park Sung-won had just made it louder. That evening, she did not call Junha. She thought about calling him. She did not call him. He was there the next morning. He looked at her face when she came in, and he knew immediately, she could see it, the slight shift in his attention, the quality of stillness that in another man might have been bracing for impact, but in him was simply paying attention. She sat down. She waited until her coffee arrived. Then she said quietly enough that it didn't carry, "Someone warned me about you yesterday." He didn't flinch. Who? A client. Someone I trust, to be honest. What did they say? That you have a certain visibility in certain circles. She watched him. That what you control privately is different from what you show publicly. The cafe noise continued around them. Someone dropped a spoon. The barista called out an order. Junha was very still. That's not wrong, he said. Her stomach tightened. How far from wrong is it? Further than you're hoping, he said, and not as far as you're afraid. That is not a useful answer. I know. He set his pen flat on the portfolio. I'm not going to lie to you, but I'm also not going to have this conversation here. Then where? Somewhere private. Tonight, if you're willing. She looked at him for a long moment. The composed face, the careful hands, the absolute absence of panic. A man with nothing to hide did not look like this. A man with something to hide and no intention of hiding it from her. That was a different thing. 7 o'clock, she said. My building has a rooftop. I'll text you the address. She went back to her screen and he went back to his portfolio, and neither of them said another word for the rest of the morning. Again, he arrived exactly at 7. Not 7:02, not 6:58. 7. She noticed this because she had arrived at 6:55 and stood in the rooftop cold wondering whether she was making a catastrophic mistake, and the precision of his timing suggested a man who understood that being late would have read as carelessness and being early would have read as pressure, and the exactness of the hour was itself a kind of answer to both. The rooftop looked out over Mapo-gu. The Han River was visible to the south, a dark ribbon between lit bridges. The city went to every horizon, stacked and lit and indifferent to individual dramas in the way that only very large cities can be. He stood beside her at the railing and looked at the skyline for a moment before he spoke. My father built something in the 1980s, he said, when this country was different, when certain kinds of power existed in spaces that the law hadn't finished defining yet. He paused. He built it from nothing, through connections and debts and arrangements that people don't discuss in daylight. By the time I was old enough to understand what it was, I was already inside it. How old? 17 when I understood. 22 when I took it over. She turned to look at him. Took it over how? My father got sick. There was no one else who could hold it without it fracturing. If it fractured, people got hurt. His voice was flat, not defensive. I made a choice. What kind of organization? The pause was measured, not evasive. She had developed a precise sensitivity to evasion. Just careful. The kind, he said, that operates in the space between legitimate business and things that governments can't or won't regulate. Financial networks, enforcement arrangements, relationships with people in positions of authority who require management. She felt the cold more acutely than she had a moment ago. You're describing organized crime. I'm describing what it is. Are you trying to make me feel better about that or worse? Neither. I'm describing it exactly because you deserve a description that's exact. She turned back to the skyline. Her hands on the railing were cold. She didn't move them. The man at the cafe, she said, the morning I noticed. One of the people my name means something to, he said. Yes. And the two men at the restaurant. He looked at her. You made them. I make everybody, she said. I've spent 20 years in rooms where people are watching me from every angle. I know what surveillance looks like. I assumed they were yours. They were. Because I don't go anywhere without it. He said it without drama. Not because I'm afraid, because the alternative creates problems for people around me. She absorbed that. Around me. She was around him. How much danger does that mean? She asked. Specifically, right now, low. My position is stable. I've spent the last 4 years moving the organization's revenue toward legitimate structures, not because I found a conscience, but because criminal enterprise is inefficient at scale, and I am very focused on efficiency. He paused. But there are people who prefer instability, who see the consolidation as a threat. There was a communication recently from one of those people. What kind of communication? A formal signal that my current activities are being watched. She stared at him. You took me to dinner in the middle of receiving a threat from a rival criminal organization. The threat was not about you. You were not at risk. That is not the point. You're right. He said it immediately. I should have told you before the dinner. I made a calculation that the risk level didn't warrant changing our plans. That was my decision to make about my security. It was not my decision to make about your information. She let that sit. It was an admission, precise and immediate. No minimization. Junha. She said his name clearly. I need you to understand something. I am not a woman who can be protected without being informed. I will not survive another relationship where someone makes decisions about my life and tells me about them afterward. I would rather have the hard conversation than the comfortable silence. I know, he said. That's why I'm standing here telling you things I've never told anyone outside my organization. Who else knows? About us. My second. His name is Yoon. He knows because it's his job to know, no one else. My client knew enough to warn me about you. Your client knows my name and what it implies. He doesn't know we're involved. He was warning you because he respects you and my name carries a certain gravity in business circles. She looked at him. What does your name do to my reputation? He was quiet for a moment. It was the first time she had seen him take a question and sit with the discomfort of it rather than moving to manage it. I don't know, he said. Honestly, in the legitimate business world, my public profile is clean. Investment executive, family corporation, no legal exposure. But in the circles where people understand more, my name means power and risk. Whether that attaches to you depends on visibility and timing and things I can't fully control. Can you control the visibility? I can try to limit it. I can't eliminate it. I move through the world in a way that gets noticed. I've spent 6 years building something here, she said. You understand what it cost. The divorce. Starting over. The way people looked at me when I arrived. The American, the black woman, the divorcee, all of it at once. I earned every client I have. I earned every referral. If your world reaches into my professional life and burns what I built, I know what it would mean. Do you? I know you built it from nothing. I know you built it after someone made you feel like nothing. I know what it would cost you to lose it, and I would not ask you to risk that lightly. He looked at her steadily. I'm asking you to trust that I will protect what you've built with the same focus I use to protect everything else that matters to me. And I'm telling you that I don't extend that to many things. The wind came off the river. Somewhere in the building below them, a door closed. I'm not saying yes, she said. I'm not asking for yes. I'm not saying no. He nodded slowly. And I'm saying, she continued, that the next time there is a threat or a communication or anything that touches the space around you, I hear about it before you decide how to respond to it. Not after. Before. Agreed, he said. No hesitation. She pushed off the railing and turned toward the rooftop door, then she stopped. One more thing. She turned back to him. Are you in love with me, or is this strategic? The question landed, and he did not flinch from it. Both things can be true, he said, but if it were only strategic, I wouldn't have told you any of what I told you tonight. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she went inside. The following 2 weeks had a surface normalcy that Amani recognized as the particular calm that preceded complicated things. They had coffee at Bora on the mornings he was in Seoul. Twice he wasn't. He gave her a day's notice each time and no explanation of where he was going, and she did not ask because they had not negotiated that territory yet. She worked. She delivered the logistics restructuring report, which her client received with the kind of enthusiasm that meant referrals, and she was approached by a mid-sized Korean tech company for a 6-month engagement that would represent the largest single contract she had managed since arriving in the country. It should have been a good 2 weeks. It mostly was, except that the awareness she had been carrying, the building noise, the structural sound she couldn't quite locate, was getting louder. A car she did not recognize sat across from her building 2 mornings in a row. It was gone by the time she came back from Bora, and she might have dismissed it entirely, except that she had spent enough time being hyper-aware of her surroundings as a black woman in spaces that weren't designed for her that her pattern recognition for things out of place was very well calibrated. She mentioned it to Junha on a Thursday. He went very quiet. What did the car look like? She described it. He nodded once, pulled out his phone, typed something, and put it away. Junha, I'm looking into it. Is this related to the communication you received? Possibly. You told me I would be informed before, not after. He looked at her directly. I don't have information yet. When I have information, I'll tell you. Right now I'm watching something to understand what it is. And in the meantime, I should go about your life exactly as normal, he said. Nothing has happened. If anything changes, you'll know immediately. She sat with the discomfort of that. She did not like uncertainty. She had reorganized her entire existence to minimize uncertainty. Sitting across the corner table from a man who ran a criminal organization while possibly being surveilled by his enemies was categorically incompatible with that reorganization, and she was aware of this, and she was still sitting here. That self-awareness did not make the discomfort smaller. The phone call came on a Saturday morning. She was in her apartment, working through the preliminary scope for the tech company engagement, when her cell phone showed a number she didn't recognize. Seoul area code. She let it ring once, twice, considered not answering. She answered. Ms. Brooks? The voice was male, middle-aged, Korean accent with a formal precision that placed him in a specific register, educated, controlled, accustomed to being listened to. I apologize for the interruption to your weekend. Who is this? My name is not important. I represent a group of people who have significant business interests in this city. We have become aware of your relationship with Kang Jun-ha. Her chest tightened. Her voice did not change. I don't discuss my personal life with people who don't identify themselves. Of course. Then I'll be direct about what I'm asking, which requires no discussion of your personal life. A pause. We would like you to encourage Junha to reconsider a particular business position he has recently taken. He respects your judgment in a way he does not extend to many people. A word from you would carry weight. She stood up from the couch. You're asking me, she said slowly, to manipulate someone I care about on behalf of people I've never met, in a dispute I know nothing about. We're asking you to have a private conversation. The content of that conversation is your choice. The answer is no. Ms. Brooks, the answer, she said, with the particular quiet that people who had worked with her for years recognized as the most dangerous version of her voice. Is no. Do not call this number again. She ended the call. She stood in the middle of her apartment with the phone in her hand and her heart hitting the inside of her ribs with a rhythm that was not fear exactly. It was something colder and steadier than fear. The physiological state of a person who has just understood the full geometry of a situation and does not love what the geometry looks like. She called Jun-ha. He picked up on the second ring. She told him, precisely and without embellishment, every word of the call. The voice, the phrasing, the specific request. The silence on his end lasted long enough that she checked the connection. Jun-ha, I'm here. His voice was flat in a way she had not heard before. The composure was still present, but it had changed quality. It was no longer restful. It was controlled in the way that a great deal of force is controlled. Are you in your apartment? Yes. Stay there. I'm coming. You don't need to eat. Imani. Her name in his mouth at that register stopped her. I made you a promise about information. Someone just used you to send me a message, which means they looked at my life and found you in it, which means my promise to keep you informed has already been overtaken by events. I need to be there. She said nothing for a moment. How long? She asked. 20 minutes. He arrived in 1820. Diro Usharstet. He came through her door, and the first thing she saw was that something in his face had reorganized. The stillness was still there, but underneath it was something she hadn't seen before. A hard, flat anger that he was managing with visible effort, the kind that didn't flare and shout, but compressed itself into something dense and cold. He sat down across from her at her kitchen table, which nobody had ever sat at except her, and he said, Tell me again. Everything. She told him again. He listened without moving. The word they used, he said. Reconsider a business position. What did that read as to you? That you've done something they don't like, that they want you to undo it. What I've done, he said, is move 3 financial networks, accounts, assets, relationships, into a legitimate holding structure. It took 4 years. I completed the last phase 10 days ago. There are people who relied on those networks for activities that can't survive legal structure. And you knew when you did this that they would push back. I knew. I believed I had managed the relationships well enough that it would be managed through channels, not... He stopped. Not through the people around me. Meaning me. Meaning you. She looked at him across her kitchen table. The city was bright and indifferent outside her windows. They're going to do this again, she said. It was not a question. If I don't respond in a way they understand, yes. What does a response they understand look like? A reversal of what I've done. He said it flatly, which I'm not going to do. So they escalate. That's how this works. She held that, the weight of it. The specific weight of being the person someone had just decided to use as a pressure point against a man who controlled a criminal empire. Jun-ha. She waited until he looked at her. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer without managing my reaction. Ask. How much danger am I in right now, specifically on a scale that means something to me? He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw was tight. She watched him decide to answer honestly. The call was a message, not an action, he said. They wanted me to know they can reach you. That's different from intending to harm you. But, he stopped. But the fact that they reached you at all means the line they've drawn has moved. And when lines move in this world, they don't always stop at the first position. The apartment was very quiet. Imani sat back in her chair. She looked at the man across her table, the composed, careful, methodical man who returned library books on time and remembered her coffee order and had just told her with complete honesty that his enemies had found her and might not be finished. I'm not going to run, she said. He had not asked her to run. She said it anyway because she needed him to hear it, and because she needed to hear herself say it, to know if it was true. It was. I know, he said, but I need to understand what comes next, not in general, specifically. What do you do tomorrow that changes where we are right now? Tomorrow, he said, I make contact with the person who authorized that call. I tell them that approaching you again in any form will be the end of every remaining arrangement I've maintained with their organization. And I mean that. And they'll know I mean it. And if they don't care, he looked at her steadily, then I do something I've spent 4 years trying to avoid. And some things that were moving toward peace move back toward conflict. Because of me. Because they chose to put you in the middle. His voice was quiet and very precise. That choice is theirs. The consequences of it are also theirs. She held his gaze for a long moment. The weight of the evening was present in the room between them. Not romantic, not comfortable, not anything like the careful space they had been building over coffee and quiet mornings. This was the reality of the man behind the composed face, the investment executive whose name made rooms go quiet. She had known somewhere that this moment would come. She had not known how quickly, and she had not known how steady she would feel inside it. Stay, she said. He looked up. Not like that, she said. I mean, don't go back across the city tonight. There's a second room. I need someone in the apartment who knows what's happening, and I'm not going to pretend that I want to be alone with this right now. He studied her face. Then he nodded, once. Okay, he said. She made tea. He sat at her kitchen table and opened his phone and began making calls in Korean, his voice low and completely flat, and she understood none of the words but understood the tone precisely. A man closing a gate that had been left open too long, with the absolute calm of someone who had always known this day was coming and had simply been hoping for more time. She sat at the other end of the table with her own tea and her laptop open because the tech company engagement brief wasn't going to write itself, and because doing the next necessary thing was how she had survived every hard season of her life. She worked. He talked. The city spread out below them, 11 million people doing 11 million things, none of them knowing that in a quiet apartment in Mapogu, a line had just been crossed that could not be uncrossed, and that on the other side of it, 2 people were sitting at the same table choosing, without saying it out loud, not to walk away. It was not safety. It was not even certainty. It was something stubborn and specific and harder than either of those things, and it was already too late to call it anything other than what it was. He left before 6 in the morning. She heard him in the kitchen, the specific sound of someone trying to move quietly through an unfamiliar space, the careful placement of a cup, the muffled click of her front door. She did not get up. She lay in the dark of her bedroom and listened to the silence that followed and thought about the shape of the evening that had just ended. The calls he had made in that controlled, flat voice, the way he had finally closed his phone at midnight and sat for a while without speaking, the tea she had made that neither of them finished. She thought about the word escalate and what it meant in the context of a man like Kang Jun-ha. Then she got up, because lying still with uncomfortable thoughts was not a strategy, and made coffee, and sat at the table where he had sat, and worked until the city outside her windows went from dark to gray to the particular pale gold of a Seoul morning in early spring. On the table, folded once, was a piece of paper. He had written on it in English, precise and small, "I'll handle the morning call. Bora at 8 if you want. Don't change your routine. Routine is armor. J." She read it twice. Then she put it in the inside pocket of her laptop bag, which was not a thing she examined too closely. Bora at 8. She was there at 7:52. He arrived at 8 exactly, ordered, sat at the window table, opened his portfolio. She was already working. They did not discuss the previous evening. They worked for 90 minutes in the particular silence that had become, over the past weeks, its own kind of language. 2 people who had stopped needing to fill the space between them with noise. At 9:15, he said quietly, "The call was made this morning." She looked up. "And?" "They received it." He turned a page in his portfolio without looking at it. "The person who authorized the approach to you is someone named Shin Dae-won. He runs what's left of a network that my father's organization absorbed in 2009 and that I've been systematically divesting from for the last 3 years. He believed the divestment was negotiable. I have made clear it is not." How did he receive that clarity? Poorly. Junha's voice was completely flat. He made statements that were intended to convey that he has leverage he hasn't yet used. What leverage? He was quiet for a moment. The cafe continued around them, spoons, voices, the machine behind the counter. He claims, Junha said carefully, to have documentation of certain activities from the early years of my leadership, before I began the restructuring. He paused. Things that would not survive public exposure. She set down her coffee. How bad? He met her eyes. Bad enough that if they went to the right people, prosecutors, certain press, they would not destroy me. But they would create years of exposure, legal costs, the kind of sustained visibility that makes legitimate business relationships very difficult to maintain. Is the documentation real? Some of it probably is. The early years were, I made decisions I wouldn't make now. I was 22 and inheriting something that required force to hold. Some of those decisions left records. He said it without self-pity, just factual accounting. Shin has been collecting leverage for years. It's what he does instead of building anything. She absorbed this. Outside the window, Yeonam-dong was going about its morning. A woman walked a very small dog. A delivery man stacked boxes. He's going to use it, she said. He's threatening to use it unless I restore his network's access to the financial channels I closed. Which you're not going to do. Which I'm not going to do? She looked at her screen. The tech company brief was open. 6 months of work, the largest contract she had managed in Korea, contingent on a professional reputation that was currently sitting inside the blast radius of a criminal organization's leverage dispute. If it goes public, she said, the documentation, the exposure, what happens to the people connected to you? He understood what she was asking. It depends on what's in the documentation and how it's deployed. My legal exposure is real but defensible over time. The exposure for people in my immediate circle is harder to predict. Define immediate circle. Business associates, family. He paused. Anyone whose name appears in proximity to mine in public. She looked at him. Me? She said. I don't know. Possibly. If Shin is willing to use you as a pressure point by phone, I don't know how far his willingness extends. The coffee in her cup was cold. She hadn't noticed. What's your move? She asked. I'm working on it, he said. Which was, she had learned, as close as he came to, I don't have one yet. The second thing went wrong 4 days later, and it came from a direction she hadn't been watching. She was finishing a client call in a coffee shop near Gwanghwamun when she looked up and saw, walking through the glass door with the particular ease of a man who had never had to wonder whether he belonged somewhere, her ex-husband. David Brooks was 51, silver at the temples now, wearing a jacket she didn't recognize and carrying a phone he was typing on as he walked, and he had not seen her yet, and for approximately 3 seconds she experienced the specific internal sensation of her stomach dropping through the floor before her professional training overrode it, and she straightened in her chair and made her face do nothing. He looked up. He saw her. The 4 seconds that followed were their own small disaster. The flicker of shock on his face, the recalibration, the performance of ease that replaced it, the walk toward her table that she watched him choose, deliberately, because David Brooks did not retreat from rooms. Amani. He said her name the way he always had, like it was slightly inconvenient. David. She said his the way she had learned to, like it cost her nothing, because it didn't anymore, which had taken 19 months and she wasn't going to waste it. I didn't know you were still in Seoul. I live here. Right. He glanced at her laptop, her coffee, the organized competence of her workspace. The consulting thing. She had built a 6-figure annual practice in a country where she had arrived knowing 3 people. She had 2 junior consultants she was considering bringing on. She had a contract on her desk that represented more revenue than anything she had managed during the 3 years they were supposed to be building a life together. What are you doing in Seoul? She asked. Meetings. Companies looking at a Korean partnership. I'm here for the week. He paused. Can I sit? I have 20 minutes. He sat. He ordered from the server without looking at the menu, and she recognized, distantly and without pain, how much of their marriage had been him making decisions without looking at the options. You look good, he said. I know. That surprised him slightly. Good. She had spent too many years of her marriage accepting compliments with the appropriate modesty, reflexively diminishing herself to fit the space he preferred. She was done with that. Are you... He stopped, reconsidered. Are you seeing anyone? She looked at him. Why? I heard something. He picked up his coffee. From Park Sung-won. You know, I've met him twice at conferences. He mentioned you're involved with someone, a Korean businessman. Of course. Of course Park had mentioned it, because Seoul's international business community was, at its highest levels, a very small room. I don't discuss my personal life in professional contexts, she said. He seemed concerned. David turned the cup in his hands. The habit was unchanged. He said the man's name is Kang, that he's significant, in ways that go beyond business. She said nothing. Imani. He leaned forward slightly. I know we ended badly. I know what I did in that boardroom. David. Her voice was not loud. It was extremely precise. If you are about to tell me you have concerns about my choices, I want you to think very carefully about whether that sentence ends anywhere useful for either of us. He stopped. I didn't come here to fight, he said. I know, you never came anywhere to fight. You came to manage. There's a difference, and you've never understood it. She closed her laptop. I'm not available to be managed anymore. She stood, gathered her things, and left him sitting at the table with his 2 quickly ordered coffee, and she walked out into the Gwanghwamun afternoon, and her hands were completely steady, and her chest felt like something that had been compressed for years had just decompressed by a single degree. Then her phone rang. Junha. She answered immediately. Where are you? His voice was different. The flatness was still there, but something underneath it was moving fast. Gwanghwamun, what happened? I need you to go directly home. Don't stop anywhere. Call me when you're in your building. Junha. Shin released something this morning. A pause, 3 seconds, controlled. It wasn't the documentation, it was something else. I need you off the street while I understand what it is. She was already walking toward the subway. Tell me what you know right now. There's a story, online 2 hours ago, Korean financial press, a reporter Shin has used before. It names me, not the organization, just the investment firm, in connection with a series of wire transfers from 2019 that look out of context, like money laundering through a legitimate technology company. Are they? The transfers are real, the interpretation is manufactured, but the technology company... He stopped. What about it? The technology company is one of your clients. The subway entrance was directly in front of her. She stopped walking. The city noise continued around her. Horns, voices, the mechanical exhale of a bus. She stood in the middle of the pavement and felt the geometry of the situation lock into its actual shape, the one she should have been able to see coming and hadn't. Which client? She said. Her voice was very quiet. He told her. It was the tech company, the 6-month engagement, the largest contract she had managed in Korea. She did not go home. She went to her office, a small suite she rented in a building in Mapogu, because the engagement contract was on her desk there, and she needed to look at it physically, needed to hold the paper in her hands while she understood what was happening. Junha called twice on the subway. She let them ring. She was not angry at him. Not yet, or not only, or not in a way she could currently separate from the larger cold thing spreading through her chest. She needed to think before she talked to anyone. The office was empty. Her junior consultant, Hye-yeon, worked remotely on Thursdays. Imani sat down, opened the engagement file, and went through it with the methodical focus she applied to everything, looking for the specific intersection between her work and whatever Shin had manufactured. It took her 40 minutes to find it. The technology company, Hansotech, had gone through a restructuring of its payment processing systems 18 months before she engaged with them. Part of that restructuring had involved a series of international wire transfers to establish new banking relationships. She had not been their consultant at that time. She had nothing to do with those transfers. But in the story Shin had pushed to the financial press, Those transfers were described as part of a broader network of financial instruments associated with Kang Joon-ha's investment activities. And Amani Brooks was named as a current strategic consultant to Hanso Tech with reported personal connections to Kang. Nothing false, individually. Each sentence provably accurate. The architecture of it was the problem. The specific way the facts had been arranged to suggest a shape that wasn't there. She sat back in her chair. The office was very quiet. Her phone had 7 missed calls, 3 from Joon-ha, 2 from Ha-yoon, who had probably seen the story, 1 from the managing director at Hanso Tech, which made her close her eyes for 3 full seconds, and 1 from a number she didn't recognize, which she knew without answering was not going to be friendly. She called Joon-ha. He answered before the first ring finished. "Where are you?" "My office. I'm not in danger. I'm reading the story." Her voice was level. "This is Shin." "Yes." "He named me specifically." "Yes." A pause. "I'm sorry. I didn't anticipate he would move this fast or that he would include you this directly. He didn't include me as a target. He included me as a demonstration." She stared at the engagement file. "He's showing you what he can reach. The documentation threat was abstract. This is concrete. He just touched my professional life with your name, and now the Hanso managing director has called me, and I don't know yet whether I still have a contract." "Imani, let me finish." She put her hand flat on the desk. "I am not blaming you. I am telling you what has happened, so we're working from the same information. Can you hear the difference?" A pause. "Yes." "What's your read on Shin's next move? If I don't respond to this within 48 hours in a way he finds satisfactory, he escalates to the documentation, which is a longer burn, legal proceedings, sustained press attention. But it's the kind of thing that restructures a landscape permanently. And responding in a way he finds satisfactory means reversing the financial restructuring." "Yes." "Which is 4 years of work." "Yes." Joon-ha. She said his name with the specific weight it had earned over the past weeks. "I need you to tell me something, and I need the completely honest version, not the version that protects me from the information." "Ask." "Did you know, when you began pursuing me, that this kind of exposure was possible? That bringing someone into your proximity meant they could be used this way?" The silence lasted long enough that she could hear, faintly, traffic on his end. "I knew it was theoretically possible," he said. "I believed I had managed my position well enough that it wouldn't materialize. I told myself that what was building between us was worth the risk, and I made that calculation without—" He stopped. "Without being fully honest about who was carrying the risk." "I was carrying it," she said. "I was carrying it, and you decided the probability was low enough that I didn't need to know." "Yes." She held the phone and looked at the engagement file and thought about Park Sung-won's careful warning and the car outside her building and the phone call on a Saturday morning and all the small accumulating signals she had noted and filed and chosen, each time, to continue anyway. She had not been uninformed. She had been given pieces and had chosen to hold them. But she had not been given the full shape. And the full shape was sitting on her desk right now in the form of a financial press article that had her name in it. "I need to handle the Hanso call," she said. "I know. And then I need to think." "I understand." "Don't—" She stopped, started again. "Don't make any moves on Shin until we talk. I mean that. I am inside this now, and I am not going to be managed around it. Whatever you do next, I'm part of that conversation." Another pause, and she heard in it the specific friction of a man whose instinct was to protect by acting unilaterally, making contact with the promise he had made her on a rooftop 2 weeks ago. "Okay," he said. She called Hanso Tech. The managing director's name was Choi Byung-il, 54 years old, a cautious man who had built his company carefully over 20 years and had, when Imani came in, made clear that he valued her precisely because she was rigorous and without unnecessary complication. The call lasted 19 minutes. He was not unkind. He was extremely careful. The engagement, he said, would need to be paused. while the company's legal team reviewed the situation. He was certain it would be temporary. He used the word temporary 3 times, which was how she knew it probably wasn't. She said she understood, that she would make her transition documentation available, that she hoped to continue the relationship when the situation clarified. She put the phone down. The office was very quiet. She had built this, specifically, carefully, deliberately. She had built this practice from the ground up in a country that had every reason not to take her seriously and had earned its respect anyway. She had done it after losing a marriage and a boardroom and 11 years of a life that turned out to be sitting on sand. She had done it with the particular ferocity of a person who has been told, in the most public and deniable way possible, that they are replaceable. And now it was cracking, because the man she had chosen, with open eyes, had made a calculation about her risk tolerance that turned out to be wrong. She was not going to cry. She hadn't cried in her office since her 2nd month in Seoul, when a contract had fallen through and she had allowed herself 20 minutes alone in this room before she reconstructed the proposal and resubmitted it. Crying was not the issue. The issue was the cold and very precise fury that was building behind her sternum, the kind that didn't shake, the kind that organized itself into something focused and actionable. She called Ha-eun and told her to prepare a clean summary of all active client engagements, any contracts pending signature, and a list of every professional contact who had sent communications in the last 48 hours. Ha-eun did not ask questions, which was why Imani had hired her. Then she sat for 10 minutes and did nothing but breathe and think. She thought about David in that boardroom in Chicago, the 12 people who had said nothing, the way erasure worked when it was performed by someone with enough authority to make it look like fact. She thought about the years she had spent making herself smaller so he could feel larger, and the specific moment she had stopped, and how long it had taken to understand that stopping was not a failure, but the only sane response to an insane situation. She thought about Junha and the rooftop and the promise she had extracted from him about information and the way he had kept part of it and failed part of it, and whether those 2 things were separable, and how angry she was exactly, and at what. She thought about Shin Dae-won, whom she had never met, who had used her name in a financial press article as a demonstration of reach, and what it meant that she was inside a situation where someone she had never encountered could do that. And she thought about what she was going to do about it. Not what Junha was going to do, not what anyone's organization was going to do, but what she, Imani Brooks, with the specific skills and intelligence and resources she actually possessed, was going to do to reclaim the ground that had just shifted under her. Because the ground had shifted, but she was still standing on it. She went to him that evening. Not because she had decided everything, because she had decided enough. His apartment was in Hanam-dong, high floor, the kind of building that didn't need to announce itself. She had never been there before. She stood at the door, and the man who opened it, not Junha, a lean, watchful man in his early 30s, who looked at her with the particular attention of someone whose job was to assess threats, stepped back without a word and let her in. The apartment was not what she expected, which meant she had expected wrong. It was spare and very clean, books on actual shelves, a long table with papers arranged in careful order. No art. One window that looked out over the Han River in a way that suggested the view had been specifically selected. It smelled like coffee and the faint trace of the particular soap she had come to associate with him. Junha was at the table. He stood when she came in. The watchful man disappeared. He looked at her face and said nothing. "Sit," she said. "I'm going to talk and I need you to listen without interrupting until I'm done." He sat. She didn't sit. She stood across the table from him and she said with complete precision, "Shin Dae-won used my name today, not as collateral damage, as a message to you. He named me in public because he's calculated that I matter to you and that you'll behave differently knowing I'm exposed." She paused. "Is that calculation correct?" Junha's jaw was tight. "Yes." "Then we have a structural problem, which is that I am now a liability in your negotiation. The more I matter, the more he can use me, which means that every day this continues, the threat to my professional life increases, and the pressure on you to capitulate increases, and neither of those things is acceptable." "I know." "You said you wouldn't reverse the restructuring." I won't. Then we need a third option. She put her hands flat on his table. And I think I know what it is, but I need information you haven't given me yet. I need to understand the documentation Shin has, not the general shape of it, the specific content. What years, what transactions, what names? He looked at her. Something had shifted in his expression, not surprise exactly, something more like recognition. Why? Because I'm a corporate strategist, she said. My entire career is built on understanding the difference between what information looks like and what it actually means. I read financial narratives for a living. I find the holes in arguments that are built to look airtight. She held his gaze. If Shin's documentation is real but contextually distorted, the way the story today was distorted, then there is a counter-narrative. There is a way to diffuse it that doesn't involve giving him what he wants. Junha was very still. You're talking about going after his leverage directly, he said. I'm talking about understanding it well enough that he knows you can answer it, not in court, not publicly, just making it clear that what he's holding is not the weapon he thinks it is. She straightened. But I can only do that if you tell me everything, not the version that protects me from discomfort. Everything. He looked at her for a long moment. The apartment was very quiet. The Han River was dark and wide beyond the window. If I tell you everything, he said slowly, you can't unknow it. The things from the early years, the decisions I made at 22. I'm aware of that. You might not like the person those decisions describe. I might not. She did not soften it. But right now someone is using my name in financial press, and I've just lost the largest contract I've managed in 6 years in this country. And the person I'm looking at is the only one with the information I need to think my way out of this situation. So I'm going to need to know who you were at 22, Junha, and I'm going to need to decide what I think about it after I have the full information. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Yoon. The watchful man appeared in the doorway. Junha spoke to him in Korean, brief and precise. Yoon disappeared and returned with a thick manila folder, which he set on the table and left without a word. Junha put his hand on the folder. He looked at her. Once you read this, he said, the decision you're already carrying gets heavier. I know how to carry heavy things, she said. He slid the folder across the table. She opened it, and what she saw in the first 3 pages made her understand, with the cold clarity of a person whose pattern recognition has just locked onto something she cannot unsee, exactly how far from ordinary life she had traveled, and exactly what it was going to cost her to find a way through. She read for 2 hours without stopping. Junha did not hover. He made coffee, set a cup beside her without comment, and moved to the far end of the table where he worked through his own papers in silence, giving her the specific gift of space inside a confined room. She understood, without being told, that this was deliberate, that he had made a decision to let her land wherever she was going to land without trying to soften the impact. The folder contained transaction records, internal communications, and a series of documented arrangements from 2009 through 2014, the years immediately following his takeover of the Kang organization at 22. She had worked with financial documents her entire career. She knew how to read the architecture of an arrangement, how to identify what the numbers were actually describing beneath the language used to describe them. What she read was not the work of a careless man or a cruel one. It was the work of a very young man who had inherited something enormous and violent and had made the calculated decision to hold it together through methods that left marks. Enforcement agreements. Payments to officials she recognized as mid-level government figures. 3 instances of documented pressure applied to business competitors, whose situations had resolved in the Kang organization's favor through means that a court would not have approved. Nothing that rose to the level of direct physical harm, but the distance from that level was not always comfortable, and there were 2 entries in 2011 that she read 3 times, and each time she read them, her jaw tightened by a degree. At the end of the 2nd hour, she closed the folder. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the cover. The 2011 entries, she said. He looked up. The pressure campaign against the Busan Shipping Company. 2 of their executives left the industry entirely within 6 months. Yes. Were they harmed physically? No. His voice was even. They were made to understand that continued operation in that sector would create problems that would not be worth managing. They chose to leave. And if they hadn't chosen? A pause. I was 23. I would like to tell you the answer is clean. I don't know if that's true. She absorbed that. You don't know. I was managing people who had operated for 30 years under different rules. I was holding something together with force I didn't always fully control. Some of what I prevented from happening, I prevented. Some of what might have happened, I don't know if I prevented it or if it just didn't happen. The honesty was brutal. She had asked for it and she received it, and she sat with the specific weight of a man telling her he couldn't account for the full edges of his own history. Shin's documentation, she said. How much of this is in it? Probably the 2011 entries, some of the official payments, the transaction records through 2013. Not the later years. The later years are clean. I made sure of it. She opened the folder again to the transaction records. She looked at them with the particular focus she brought to financial narratives, not reading the content, but reading the structure, the way the information was organized and what that organization was designed to suggest. This is manageable, she said. He looked at her carefully. Explain. The payments to officials are documented as consulting fees. Whoever structured these, your finance people in 2010, they were careful. The paper trail describes relationships, not bribes. That's not innocent, but it's defensible in the kind of gray zone that Korean corporate law has been extremely reluctant to pursue. She turned a page. The 2011 entries describe competitive pressure, not coercion. If Shin takes these to a prosecutor, what a prosecutor sees as aggressive business practice in a sector with a documented history of aggressive business practice. Shin isn't going to a prosecutor, he's going to the press. Which is different. She looked up. Press exposure requires a narrative, a story that a reader can follow. What Shin has is a collection of transactions that look bad when placed next to your name. But your name right now is Kang Jun-ha, investment executive, with a 4-year record of moving a family corporation toward legitimate structure. That's a counter-narrative. It's not perfect, but it's real and it's documentable. Jun-ha leaned forward slightly. You're describing a communication strategy. I'm describing reality arranged to counter a different arrangement of reality, which is what Shin did today in that article. She closed the folder. He doesn't have a weapon. He has a story. And a story can be answered with a better story, if the better story is true and you're willing to put it in public. Going public with the restructuring, not all of it, the arc of it. The deliberate 4-year movement from a certain kind of operation to a legitimate corporate structure, with documentation, with specific milestones, in a format that a financial journalist who isn't owned by Shin can understand and verify. She held his gaze. It doesn't erase 2011, but it contextualizes it inside a trajectory. And trajectory is everything in how people read a story. He was quiet for a long moment. Something was moving behind his eyes. Not resistance, she thought. Something more like the particular recalibration of a person who has just been shown an angle they hadn't considered. This exposes me, he said. Even the clean version of this is exposure. Yes. It would end certain relationships. People who do business with me because of what I've been. Probably. It might not work. Shin could respond by accelerating the release of the documentation before we can establish the counter-narrative. He could. She didn't soften it. That's the risk. The question is whether the risk of trying this is better than the alternative, which is giving him what he wants. Which is giving him what he wants, she agreed, and then doing this same calculation in 2 years when he asks for something else. The apartment was quiet. The Han River reflected the city lights in long, broken lines. If I do this, Jun-ha said slowly, I need to move in the next 24 hours, before Shin decides the 48-hour window has passed. Then we have tonight to build the framework. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Yoon, Hua. Yoon came in and his eyes moved to Amani and then to Jun-ha with the specific expression of a man assessing a significant development and keeping his assessment internal. Jun-ha said, in English, for her benefit, she understood, she's going to help us build the counter-narrative. I need you to pull the restructuring documentation, everything from the last 4 years with external verification. legal filings, partnership agreements, the banking transition records. Yoon looked at her for one more moment. Then he looked at Junha. All of it. All of it. Yoon left. He came back in 11 minutes with 2 large accordion files and a laptop and set them on the table without ceremony, and then took a chair at the far end and opened his own computer and began working. Imani pulled the first accordion file toward her and started to build. They worked through the night. Not romantically. Not with the pleasant fiction of 2 people discovering each other by lamplight. It was a working session that ran until 3:40 in the morning, coffee going cold and being replaced, Imani asking questions, and Junha or Yoon answering with specificity, long stretches of silence broken only by the sound of typing or the controlled expression of frustration when a document wasn't where it should be. She built a timeline first, because timelines were the skeleton of any narrative, the thing you put up before you could see whether the shape of the story was defensible. The shape was defensible. Barely, in places, but defensible. By 1 in the morning, she had a 12-page framework. By 2:30, she had refined it to 9 pages with 3 supporting appendices. By 3:40, she had something she would have put in front of a corporate board without apology. She pushed it across the table to Junha. He read it in silence. She watched him read it, not watching his face for approval, watching the quality of his attention, whether he was reading or performing reading. He was reading. He went back to page 4 twice, which was the page where the 2011 period was addressed, and she had been careful there, so not erasing it, not minimizing it, framing it with the specificity of a transition period in which certain methods gave way to others, documented by the subsequent years of verifiable behavior change. He finished. He set it flat on the table. "This is good," he said. "It's accurate," she said. "That's what makes it good." "There's a journalist," Yoon said from the far end of the table. Both of them looked at him. He had been so quiet for so long that the sound of his voice was slightly startling. "Lee Soo-jin, Financial Times Korean desk. She's done 3 pieces on chaebol restructuring in the last 2 years. She's not owned." "By Shin," Imani said. "By anyone, best I can determine." Yoon looked at Junha. "If we're going to place this narrative somewhere that has credibility and reach, she's the right person." Junha nodded slowly. "Can we get her a meeting in the morning?" "I can try." "Try hard." Yoon made a call in Korean, low-voiced, standing by the window. She watched the Han River behind him and thought about the sequence of events that had led her to this table at 3:40 in the morning, doing crisis communications for a criminal organization's legitimization campaign, and the thought had a dark absurdity to it that she did not share with the room. When Yoon finished the call, he said, 9 o'clock, she'll meet." Junha looked at Imani. "Will you come?" "I'll come," she said. "But I'm not there as your whatever. I'm there as a corporate strategy consultant who has reviewed the documentation and can speak to the legitimacy of the restructuring arc. That's my professional capacity." "That's the truth," he said. "Yes, which is why I can say it without lying." She gathered her materials, asked Yoon for a folder, organized the framework and the supporting appendices with the habitual precision of a woman who had never in her professional life submitted disorganized work. Then she looked at the time and calculated that 4 hours of sleep was better than 3, and said she was going home. Junha walked her to the door. In the hallway, he said quietly, "What you did tonight, the folder, reading it and then doing this instead of—" "Don't," she said. "Not unkindly. We're not done yet. Thank me when there's something to thank me for." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. She went home in a car Yoon had arranged and fell asleep thinking about page 4 of the framework and whether the language around the 2011 entries was precisely calibrated or whether it needed one more pass in the morning. It needed one more pass. She made it at 7:15 over coffee in her apartment, tightened 2 sentences, and was at the address Yoon had texted her by 8:50. Lee Soo-jin was 40 years old, small, with the particular focused quality of a journalist who had stopped caring whether she was liked and had redirected that energy entirely toward whether she was right. She looked at Amani when they were introduced with the specific attention of someone cataloging information, and then looked at the folder Amani placed on the table and said, in excellent English, "What is this?" "A primary source document," Imani said, "supported by 4 years of verifiable financial filings, partnership records, and externally audited corporate restructuring milestones." About Kang Jun-ha. About the Kang corporate group's transition from a certain historical operational model to its current structure. Imani held the journalist's gaze. "I understand you've seen the piece that ran yesterday." "I wrote a response piece this morning. It hasn't published yet." "What does the response piece say?" Lee Soo-jin looked at her with a fraction of a smile. "That the sourcing is thin and the framing has the fingerprints of someone with an agenda." She picked up the folder. "Who are you exactly in this situation?" "I'm a corporate strategy consultant who has reviewed the restructuring documentation and can speak to its veracity. I have no financial relationship with the Kang Group." She paused. "I have a personal relationship with Kang Jun-ha, which I am disclosing to you directly, so it's not a variable you discover later." Lee Soo-jin looked at her for a long moment. Then she opened the folder. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Lee asked questions with the precision of a person who had spent years identifying the seams in a narrative where the true architecture showed through, and Amani answered each one directly and referred to the documentation when the answer required evidence and said, "I don't know" 3 times when she didn't know, because a source who claims to know everything is a source who is managing you. Jun-ha spoke twice, both times at Amani's prompting, both times to specific questions about the restructuring timeline that only he could answer. He was composed and exact and did not oversell and did not hedge, and Lee Soo-jin's pen moved steadily. At the end, Lee closed the folder and looked at both of them and said, "I'll need 48 hours to verify independently." "You have it," Juna said. "If verification holds, my piece runs Wednesday. It will not be flattering in every particular. There are things in this record that I will report accurately." "I know," he said. "You're comfortable with that." "I'm comfortable with accurate." She looked at him with the same fraction of a smile she'd directed at Amani earlier. "That's a very unusual sentence coming from where you're sitting." "I know that too," he said. They were in the elevator going down when Imani's phone lit up with a number she recognized. Hanso Tech, Choi Byung-il. She answered. The call lasted 4 minutes. She stood in the lobby of the building where they had just met with Lee Soo-jin and listened and said very little and ended the call. Jun-ha watched her face. "The engagement is terminated," she said. Not paused. Terminated. Her voice was flat. He was very apologetic. His legal team had concerns they couldn't resolve in a reasonable time frame. The lobby was cold and bright. Someone walked past them toward the elevators. "I'm sorry," Jun-ha said. "Don't." She put the phone in her bag. "Not right now." She walked out of the building into the mid-morning Seoul air and stood on the pavement and breathed, and the fury from the night before was still there. But it had reorganized itself again, compressed into something denser, and she thought about what it meant to lose the largest contract she had managed in 6 years. And she thought about it for approximately 90 seconds, and then she made herself stop thinking about it because 90 seconds was all she could afford right now. "What does Shin do when the Lee piece runs?" she said. Jun-ha came to stand beside her. "He regroups. The documentation threat loses potency if the counter-narrative is already established. He can still release it, but the story it tells is different. Not exposure of a hidden truth, just a supplementary detail in a story that's already been publicly told." "So he moves to something else?" "Yes." "What else does he have?" "I've been thinking about that since last night." Jun-ha's voice was careful. "Shin's model is leverage. He collects it, holds it, deploys it at maximum pressure points. He used you once. If the press strategy neutralizes the documentation, he'll look for a different pressure point, meaning he comes back to me. Or goes around me entirely." He paused. "There are people in my organization, not close, peripheral, who have relationships with Shin's network, information channels. If he decides that attacking my legitimacy publicly isn't working, he might shift to attacking the organization's structural stability, trying to create defections. Can he do that? Some. Not enough to fracture it, but enough to be destabilizing while I'm already dealing with the press situation. She looked at him. So we're fighting a two-front situation. Possibly. What's the move on the second front? I need to have conversations with 3 specific people in the next 24 hours. He said it without drama. I need to get to them before Shin does. Go, she said. He looked at her. I don't want to leave you. Junha. She turned to face him fully. I have my laptop, I have my client list, and I have a professional situation to begin reconstructing. I am not a person who needs to be stayed with. Go do what you need to do. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read, something that was not gratitude because it was larger than that, and not relief because it was more specific, and she filed it away for a time when she had bandwidth to examine it. I'll be back by 8, he said. I'll be at my office. He left. She went back to work. He was not back by 8. By 9, she had called twice with no answer. By 9:30, she had a response from Yoon. 3 words in Korean, which her translation app rendered as situation, handling, standby. By 10:15, she was sitting in her office with the overhead lights off, working by the lamp on her desk, and the particular stillness of late-night empty buildings was pressing in from every direction. At 10:40, the door opened. She looked up. It was not Junha. It was Yoon, and his face was doing the specific controlled nothing that she had learned to read as the expression he wore when something had gone wrong and he had not yet received instruction on how much to disclose. Behind him were 2 men she had seen once before. At the restaurant in Hongdae on their first dinner, the quiet men at separate tables. They were inside her office now, which meant the door had been unlocked without her seeing, which meant they had been outside for some time. Where is he? She said. Yoon came fully into the room and closed the door. There was a meeting, he said, this evening with the 3 people Junha needed to reach before Shin did. And Shin reached one of them first. Yoon's voice was even and deliberate. The meeting was altered. The venue was not the agreed venue. By the time we understood the situation, Junha was already inside it. Her hands were flat on the desk. She kept them flat. Is he hurt? He's not hurt. He's with Shin. The room was very quiet. He's with Shin, she said. Shin invited him, through the defecting associate, to a direct conversation. Junha chose to take it rather than walk away. Yoon paused. That was his decision. Why didn't he call me? I think, Yoon said carefully, he made a decision about what information was appropriate to share before the outcome was known. The fury came back cold and specific, and she let herself feel it for exactly 3 seconds before she set it aside. Where? She said. Ms. Brooks. Where is he, Yoon? Yoon looked at her with the particular assessment she had seen in his eyes the first night. The rapid recalibration, the updating of a prior estimate. Whatever he had thought of her in the elevator of Junha's building, he appeared to be revising it. A hotel in Junggu, he said. Private floor. Shin has it secured. How many people? Inside, we estimate 8. Outside, another 4 in the lobby. She picked up her laptop and her files in her bag. Take me there. Junha didn't authorize. Junha, she said, pulling on her jacket, is currently in a room with the man who cost me a 6-year contract, used my name in a national press article, and called my phone on a Saturday morning. I am not waiting in my office while Shin uses the leverage of an unobserved conversation to extract a different version of what he couldn't get through the press. She looked at Yoon directly. I'm not a gun. I'm not muscle. I am the person in this situation who built a counter-narrative in one night that a Financial Times journalist found credible enough to spend 2 hours on, and right now what Junha is sitting across from is a man who is very good at arranging information to tell the story he wants told. I do that professionally. Take me there. Yoon held her gaze. Then he stepped aside. Bummet. The car moved through Jonggu in the particular quiet of Seoul past 11. The streets still peopled, but thinner. The neon cycling through its colors without an audience large enough to justify the effort. Imani sat in the back seat and went through the framework document on her laptop and thought about what Shin Dae-won would want from a direct conversation with Junha and what tools he would use to get it. He would want a reversal. He would frame it as a negotiation, but it was a reversal, restoration of the financial access that the restructuring had closed. He would use the documentation as the primary threat and probably introduce something new, a detail or connection he'd been holding back, to demonstrate that his reserves were deeper than expected. He would position the conversation as a one-time offer. Except now, the problem disappears, refuse, and the documentation deploys. What he would not expect was that the counter-narrative already existed, had already been placed with a credible journalist, and was 48 hours from publication. That changed the geometry of the room. She needed to get into that room. Yoon's phone buzzed. He answered, listened, said 2 words, ended the call. "Junha knows you're coming," he said. "How?" "He asked me 20 minutes ago where you were. I told him." A pause. He said, and I'm translating precisely, "Tell her the 11th floor, room 12, and tell her not to do anything before she's inside the room." She looked at Yoon's profile in the front seat. "He knows me," she said. "He knows you," Yoon agreed, and there was something in his voice that was not quite approval, but was adjacent to it. The hotel was a mid-tier business property, the kind with a lobby designed to suggest more than it delivered. Yoon moved through it with the specific purposeful ease that made lobby security look the other way, and the 2 men from her office fell into positions she understood were not decorative. 11th floor. The hallway was carpeted and silent. Room 12 was at the far end. Outside it, 2 men who worked for Shin stood with the specific stillness of people who had been told to stand and not to think. They watched Amani and Yoon approach, and one of them put his hand out. "She has a meeting," Yoon said. "She's not on the list." "She is now," Amani said, and reached past the man's outstretched arm and knocked on the door. A pause. Then Junha's voice from inside. "Come in." The man at the door looked at the man beside him. Something passed between them. The door opened. The room was a mid-sized hotel suite with a table and several chairs and the kind of deliberately neutral decor that made it impossible to remember afterward. 3 men she didn't know sat against one wall. Junha was at the table, and across from him was a man in his 60s with the compact, contained physicality of someone who had spent decades in rooms where the wrong movement had consequences. Gray-haired, watchful, a stillness that was a different quality from Junha's, older and more settled into its own violence. Shin Dae-won looked at Amani the way a chess player looks at a piece that has appeared on the board without his having moved it. Junha looked at her, and his face did not change, but something in his shoulders dropped by a fraction, which on him was the equivalent of a significant visible reaction. She pulled out a chair and sat down at the table. "I'm Amani Brooks," she said to Shin, in the same quiet and completely precise voice she had used on David in the Gwangwaman coffee shop, on Park Sung-won in his office, on Lee Soo-jin across a folder of documents. "I'm a corporate strategy consultant. I understand you've been managing a negotiation that involves some documentation you believe has value as leverage." Shin looked at her, then at Junha, then back at her. "I know who you are," he said. His English was accented and deliberate. "Then you know that the article yesterday named me specifically." She set her laptop bag on the table. "Which means I have a professional and personal interest in how this conversation ends." "This conversation," Shin said carefully, "is between Kang and myself." "It was," she said, "but you made it larger than that when you used my name." She opened her bag, pulled out the framework document, and set it on the table facing him. "I want to show you something." Shin looked at the document. He did not pick it up. His eyes moved from the cover page to her face and back. "What is this?" he said. "This is the counter-narrative that publishes in 48 hours in the Financial Times Korean edition," she said. "Written with primary source documentation, externally verified, structured to contextualize the historical record you've been collecting inside a 4-year trajectory of demonstrable change." She kept her voice completely even. "Which means the documentation you're holding stops being an exposure and becomes a footnote in a story that's already been told." The room was very still. Shin's face did not move, but something behind his eyes moved fast and cold, and she felt the weight of it from across the table. "You move fast," he said. "I always move fast when someone touches what I've built." Shin looked at Junha, a long look, specific and measuring, then back at Amani. "The article can be contested," he said. "My documentation is primary source." Contest it, she said, please. Because then it becomes a story about a man who spent years collecting leverage on a business rival and deployed it when that rival chose legitimacy over accommodation. She tilted her head slightly. That story also has a subject, Mr. Shin, and that subject is you. The silence in the room had a physical quality, a pressure. One of the men against the wall shifted slightly. Nobody else moved. Shin set his hands flat on the table. They were large hands, steady, and they pressed into the surface with the specific controlled force of a man who was deciding something. You came here, he said to Junha very quietly. With her. She came on her own, Junha said. His voice was even. That's who she is. Shin looked at Amani for a long moment. She held the look without moving, without blinking faster than normal, without any of the small physical signals that told a man like Shin Daiwan that he had found the edge of someone's composure. Leave us, Shin said. She didn't move. Ms. Brooks? His voice had dropped to something quieter and more specific. I'm asking you to leave the room. No, she said. And Junha's hand moved across the table and covered hers, not possessively, not dramatically, just present, the specific weight of a person choosing which side of a line they're standing on. And Shin saw it, and something in his face recalculated with the cold speed of a man updating his read on a situation that had just become categorically different from what he had prepared for. You understand, Shin said slowly, that if this conversation ends without an agreement, what I release will still damage both of you. It might, Junha said. We've decided we can survive damage. You've decided. Shin looked between them. Both of you. Both of us, Amani said. The words sat in the room. Shin looked at his hands on the table. The calculation running behind his eyes was visible in the particular stillness of a man whose leverage had just been partially neutralized by someone he had dismissed as a peripheral variable, and who was now renegotiating the room's geometry from across a table with a document folder and the specific quiet of a person who has decided they have nothing left to lose and found, in that decision, something that looked very much like power. He picked up the framework document. He began to read. And Amani sat across from him with her hands steady and her back straight and the full weight of everything she had built and lost and rebuilt sitting behind her eyes. And she did not look at Junha, and she did not look at the door, and she did not calculate the exit. She watched Shin read, and she waited, and the room held its breath around her while the next thing that was going to happen gathered itself in the silence between one page and the next. Shin read slowly. Not the way a person reads when they are absorbing information. The way a person reads when they are buying time, when the information has already registered on the first pass, and what they are doing now is constructing the room they are going to inhabit after the reading is finished. Amani recognized this because she had sat across from enough executives in enough boardrooms to understand the difference between a man processing and a man deciding, and what Shin Daiwan was doing right now was deciding. The suite was very quiet. The three men against the wall had the particular stillness of people trained to wait without visible cost. Yoon stood near the door, his face doing nothing. Junha's hand had moved back to his side of the table. He had placed it there, she understood, not because the gesture was complete, but because it had been made and did not need to be held. Shin turned the last page. He squared the document against the table's edge with the automatic precision of a man who could not tolerate misalignment in his immediate environment. He looked at it for a moment without speaking. Then he said, to no one specifically, Lee Soo-jin. Yes, Amani said. She's thorough. He said it the way you say something about a natural phenomenon. Not approving, not condemning, just acknowledging a property of the world. She's going to find the 2011 entries regardless of how you framed them. The framing will be in the piece, Amani said, which is why the framing matters. The framing is yours. The documentation is his. She kept her voice even. The framing describes what the documentation actually shows, in the context of what came before and after it. That's not spin. That's narrative accuracy. Shin looked at her for a long moment. You're very good at this. I know. You understand that this... He tapped the document lightly. does not resolve the fundamental problem between Kang's organization and mine. The financial channels are still closed. That remains. I understand that. And you understand that I don't simply accept a loss because someone has prepared a counter-narrative. His voice had no heat in it. It was the voice of a man whose anger had, over decades, compressed itself into something so dense it had stopped needing to be expressed. I understand that too, Amani said. Which is why I want to ask you something directly. Shin waited. The financial channels you want restored, she said. What specific function do they serve that you can't accomplish through other means? A pause. Shin looked at her with the fractional recalibration she had seen when she first walked in. The updating of an assessment, a variable that had not been in the equation presenting itself as significant. That's not a question for this table, he said. It might be. She leaned forward slightly. Because if what you need is liquidity movement through untraceable structures, there are legitimate instruments that accomplish a version of that. Not identical, but close enough to serve the core function, depending on what the core function actually is. She held his gaze. I've spent 20 years building legitimate financial structures for people who were previously operating in gray zones. I know what the gray zone is protecting, and I know what it's costing. The room was silent enough that she could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. Shin looked at Junha. She negotiates for you now. She negotiates for herself, Junha said. I'm listening. Shin looked back at Amani. Something had shifted in his eyes. Not softening, nothing as simple as that. More like the moment in a chess game when an experienced player acknowledges that the position on the board is not the position they prepared for, and they must either adapt or accept the disadvantage. What you're describing, Shin said carefully, would require a level of disclosure that my operations have never... I know what it would require, Amani said. I'm not asking you to do it tonight. I'm asking whether the requirement is the obstacle or whether there's a different obstacle underneath it. A long silence. The requirement, Shin said finally, is not the only obstacle. What's the other one? He looked at her, and for the first time since she had walked through the door, something in his face moved that was not calculation. It was old and specific, and she recognized it because she had spent enough years in rooms with powerful men to know what it looked like when one of them arrived at the edge of something he had never expected to say out loud. Trust, he said. The channels were built over 30 years. What Kang dismantled was not just the mechanism. It was the history of the arrangement, the accumulated proof that the arrangement held. He paused. You can't build a legitimate instrument to replace 30 years. The room was very still. No, Amani said. You can't. She let that sit. She did not rush past it or try to solve it, because some things were not problems to be solved. They were losses to be acknowledged, and the acknowledgement was the only thing that made the next step possible. Shin looked at his hands on the table. What Kang has built, he said, without looking up, is real. The restructuring. 4 years, the filings, the banking transitions. A pause. I've known this for 2 years. I didn't respond to it with acceptance. You responded with leverage, Amani said. Yes. Because acceptance would have meant acknowledging that the world you built was finished. Shin looked up at her. His eyes were very still. Yes, he said again. The word fell into the room and nobody moved and nobody tried to fill the space around it. And in that specific silence, Imani understood something about Shin Dai-won that she had not expected to understand. That the leverage campaign, the documentation, the press article, the phone call on a Saturday morning, none of it had been about the financial channels. It had been about a man who had spent 30 years building something and had watched the next generation dismantle it deliberately and efficiently, and had not been able to find any other response to that grief, except to reach for the only tool he had left. She did not feel sorry for him. He had used her name. He had cost her a contract. He had put her inside a situation that had no clean exits, but she understood him, and understanding was its own kind of information. The documentation, she said. If the Lee piece runs and establishes the counter-narrative, what do you do with it? Shin was quiet for a long moment. it loses its primary utility. So you're holding something that doesn't serve the original purpose, that exposes you to a counter-narrative of your own if you deploy it anyway, and that costs you resources to maintain. She kept her voice neutral. Is there a version of this where you release it to us rather than deploy it in exchange for something that has actual current value? What current value? She looked at Junha. Junha had been listening to this entire exchange with the focused stillness she had come to recognize as his most active state, the one that looked like waiting and was actually rapid internal processing. He looked at her now and something passed between them. Not words, just the specific communication of two people who have spent enough consecutive hours in a high-stakes situation that they have developed a shorthand the room around them cannot read. He turned to Shin. There are 3 assets in the Kang portfolio, he said, that I've been holding for disposition. They're profitable, but they're structurally inconvenient for the direction the organization is moving. A pause. They would be profitable and structurally compatible for an operation of your scale. Shin looked at him. You're offering me a transaction, Shin said. I'm offering you an exit from a position that has stopped serving its purpose, Junha said. The documentation has value as leverage only as long as my exposure is greater than your cost of holding it. Once the Lee piece runs, that calculus reverses. You can deploy it and damage me and spend the next 2 years defending yourself against a counter-narrative from someone, he glanced at Imani, brief and precise, who builds counter-narratives professionally. Or you can take 3 assets that will generate returns inside your existing structure, and we close this. And the financial channels. Gone, Junha said. That part doesn't change. Shin looked at the document on the table, at Junha, at Imani. The circuit of his attention was methodical and unhurried, a man who had made enough decisions in enough rooms to know that the quality of this kind of decision was not improved by speed. The 3 assets, he said. I want full disclosure on the liability structure before I agree to anything. You'll have it, Junha said, and the documentation transfer is contingent on verification of the asset valuations. Agreed. And the Lee piece. Shin looked at Imani. It runs as written. It runs as written, she said. I don't pull stories. I don't have that conversation with a journalist. I'm not asking you to pull it. His voice was even. I'm saying it runs. And what it says about the historical record, it says. I'm not asking for revision. A pause. I'm 63 years old, Ms. Brooks. There are things I did that are in that record that I would rather not see published. But I did them. And a man who cannot account for his own history is a man who has already lost something more important than leverage. The room was very quiet. Okay, she said. Shin stood up. He was not tall, but standing, he had the particular gravity of a man whose physical presence had been the least of his tools for so long that the body had simply reorganized itself around the intelligence behind it. He looked at Junha. Your father, he said, would not have done this. No, Junha said. He wouldn't have. Is that... Shin paused, choosing. Is that a thing you're proud of? Junha met his eyes. Yes. Shin looked at him for a moment longer. Then he picked up his jacket from the back of his chair and he looked at Imani one final time and he said very precisely, You should have been in this business 30 years ago. I was, she said. Different business, same room. Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile and not quite its opposite. He walked to the door. His men followed. Yoon stepped aside. And Shindai Wan, who had run a criminal leverage operation for 3 decades and had tried to use a woman he'd never met as a pressure point against a man he'd known since childhood, walked out of the hotel suite without looking back, and the door closed behind him, and the room exhaled. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then one of Junha's men, not Yoon, one of the others, said something in Korean, low and short, and Yoon responded with 2 words, and the man nodded and took out his phone and moved to the far corner and began making calls. Junha looked at Imani. She looked back at him. You knew about the assets, she said. It was not an accusation. It was accounting. I've been thinking about a disposal strategy for those 3 assets for 6 months, he said. Tonight seemed like the right time. You were waiting to see what I built. I was waiting to see how the room moved. He paused. You moved it. She sat back in her chair. The adrenaline of the last several hours was beginning to metabolize into something heavier, and she was aware of her body in the specific way she was only aware of it after sustained tension. The stiffness in her shoulders, the dryness in her throat, the low ache behind her eyes that meant she had been running on focus and coffee for too many consecutive hours. The Hanso contract, she said. I know. That's 6 months of work, the largest engagement I've managed here. I know. The Lee piece might help. If it establishes the counter-narrative cleanly, Choi Byung-il might reconsider. But he might not. Legal teams are conservative, and once they've made a recommendation, reversing it costs them credibility. She said it without self-pity, just mapping the landscape. I might not get that contract back. I know, he said. I'm sorry. She looked at him. The composed face, the still hands, the absolute absence of deflection. Don't apologize again, she said. I knew what I was walking into. Not all of it, not the shape of it, but enough. I made a decision to stay in the room, and the room cost me something. She paused. That's not on you alone. Some of it is. Some of it, she agreed. We can sort out the accounting later. She stood, and her knees were stiffer than she expected, which made her feel briefly and specifically her age in a way she didn't often allow. I need to go home. Yoon will take you. I can get a car. Imani. She looked at him. Let Yoon take you, he said. Please. She picked up her bag. She looked at him for a moment. The hotel room, the cleared table, the man who ran a criminal empire and had just traded 3 corporate assets for the documentation of his worst years and had said please to her about a car ride home. Okay, she said. The Lee Soo-jin piece ran on Wednesday. Imani read it at her kitchen table at 6:45 in the morning with her first coffee. And it was accurate. Unflattering in the places it had promised to be unflattering. The 2011 period was described with precision and without mercy, and the language around it was not soft. But the arc was there, verifiable and sourced, and the piece's final third was the 4 years of documented restructuring, and Lee had written it the way she wrote everything. Without apparent agenda, which was its own kind of advocacy for the truth. By noon, 2 Korean financial publications had run follow-up pieces. One was neutral. One was mildly hostile, focusing on the historical record rather than the trajectory. The third, by 4 in the afternoon, was from a journalist who had clearly been briefed by someone in Shin's remaining network and read like what it was. A response piece without new information. By the end of Wednesday, the story had a shape that Imani recognized from 20 years of watching corporate narratives settle. Not clean, not comfortable, but coherent. The kind of story that interested parties could read and reach a defensible conclusion. The kind that did not, in itself, require legal action or regulatory intervention. The kind that left a mark and did not leave a wound. Junha called at 5 in the afternoon. You've read it? Hours ago. What's your read? It holds, she said. Not perfectly. The 2011 section is going to follow you for a while in certain circles, but the counter-narrative is established. The document Shin was holding is now context, not exposure. Yes. A pause. Choi Byung-il called me this morning. She went still. What? He wanted background on the restructuring. I told him what I could tell him. I gave him Lee's contact information and told him to call her for the rest. Another pause. I don't know if it matters. She did not respond immediately. She sat with the specific feeling of not knowing, not the frustration of it, just the honest weight of a situation whose outcome had not yet declared itself. We'll see, she said. Yes. Then, are you all right? She thought about this with genuine attention because she had promised herself after David that she would not answer that question reflexively, that she would not say fine when fine was a performance and not a report. I'm tired, she said. I'm angry about the contract. I'm processing several things simultaneously, and I haven't had enough sleep in 4 days. She paused. But I'm not broken. If that's what you're asking. It's what I was asking. I'm not broken, she said again. and meant it. Choi Byung-il called her on Friday. She was in her office, working on a proposal for a different client, smaller engagement, shorter timeline, the kind of work she had been doing before the Hanso contract had presented itself as something larger. She had spent Thursday rebuilding the forward structure of her practice with the methodical focus she applied to everything, because the practice existed and had to be maintained regardless of what any single contract did or didn't do, and because work was, and had always been, the thing she could control when everything else was moving. Choi's call lasted 9 minutes. He was careful with his language, as he always was. He said that his legal team had reviewed the Lee article and the underlying documentation it referenced. He said that the team's concerns had been largely addressed by the counter-narrative structure. He said that he would like to discuss resuming the engagement, if she was still interested, with a modified scope that included a communications review component he had not originally planned for. She said she would have a revised proposal to him by Monday. She put the phone down. She sat for a moment in her office chair with the afternoon light coming through the blinds and parallel lines across her desk, and she breathed, and she let the specific relief of it move through her without turning it into anything larger than it was. It was a contract, an important contract. It was not proof of anything except that sometimes the thing you built held together under pressure, and sometimes, if you had prepared well enough and moved fast enough and refused to be moved from the ground you stood on, the ground stayed. She texted Jun-ha. Choi called. "Contract is back." His response came in 40 seconds. "I know. He called me first. I told him to call you." She looked at that for a moment, then she texted back, "Why?" "Because it's your contract. You earned it. I didn't want to be the reason you got it back. I wanted you to get it back." She set the phone face down on her desk. She looked at the afternoon light on the wall. She thought about a man who ran a criminal organization and returned library books on time and had just deliberately removed himself from the credit structure of her professional recovery because he understood, with a precision she had not expected anyone to ever have, the difference between being helped and being seen. 3 weeks later, the asset transfer completed. She was not in the room for it. It was not her room, had never been her room, and she had no interest in rooms she hadn't been invited into. Jun-ha told her about it afterward, briefly and without theater. Shin's representatives had received the documentation on the 3 assets. The counter-documentation had been transferred to Jun-ha's legal team, and the arrangement that Shin had described as 30 years of accumulated trust was formally and irrevocably concluded. "How did it feel?" she asked. They were at Bora, their corner and window tables, a Tuesday morning in late April, with the Seoul spring finally arriving in the particular decisive way Korean spring arrived. Not gradually, but all at once, like a decision. "Strange," Jun-ha said. He turned his pen in his hand. "My father built those relationships. Some of them before I was born. Ending them." He paused. It felt like settling an estate. Grief and relief at the same time. "Yes." He looked at her. "You know that feeling?" "The divorce," she said. "Yes." They were quiet for a moment. The cafe went on around them. The barista, the regular customers, the ambient noise of a room full of people doing ordinary things. "The organization," he said. "The restructuring is complete now. Everything that remains is legitimate, or can be made legitimate within the legal frameworks currently in place." He paused. "It's not what my father built. It's not what I inherited. It's something else." "What is it?" "I'm still finding out." He looked at his notebook. "It's smaller, more exposed to normal risk, market risk, regulatory risk, the kind of risk that doesn't respond to the tools I've spent 15 years developing." A pause. "It's also yours," she said. He looked up. "Yes. The first version was your father's. You inherited it and you held it, and then you changed it. This version you built." She picked up her coffee. "That's different." "It is," he said quietly. She looked out the window at the street below, the spring green trees, the particular quality of April light in this city that she had come to know. The way you come to know any place you have chosen deliberately. Not just its surface, but its moods, its rhythms, the way it looked at 7:45 in the morning when your coffee was the right temperature and the work in front of you was the right kind of hard. She had chosen this city. After the boardroom in Chicago, after David's voice saying replaceable with 12 people watching, after the 19 months of rebuilding she had done with the ferocity of someone who had stopped waiting to be told she was allowed to take up space, she had chosen Seoul, and Seoul had been harder than she expected and had given her more than she'd anticipated, and now it had also given her this. A window table and a man with a leather portfolio who had spilled coffee on her laptop and turned out to be the most complicated and the most honest person she had encountered in years. She did not say any of this. She went back to her screen. After 12 minutes, he said, "I'd like you to see something." "When?" "This weekend. It's outside the city. About 2 hours." She looked at him. "What is it?" "The family estate. Where I grew up." He said it carefully, feeling the weight of the words as he placed them. "I haven't taken anyone there in a long time. I want you to see it." She understood what this was. Not a gesture, not a romantic staging. He was offering her the actual interior of his life. The part before the organization, before the inheritance, before the decisions at 22. The part that had made him who he was, before the weight of the rest of it settled. "Okay," she said. He looked at her. The question behind his eyes was not about the weekend. She knew this. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. Not dramatically, just accurately. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, once, and went back to his notebook. The drive took 2 hours and 20 minutes, through Seoul's edges, and then out into the landscape that Seoul became when it was done with itself. Mountains and valleys, and the specific green of Korean rural spring, which was different from any green she had seen anywhere else, deeper and more saturated, like the color had been sitting in the ground all winter and had released itself all at once. He drove. She sat in the passenger seat with her laptop bag, because she had brought work out of habit and then had not opened it, and after an hour she put it in the back seat and watched the road instead. They talked, and they didn't talk, in the particular rhythm of two people who have stopped needing every silence to be filled. She asked him about the estate. His father's father had built the main house in the 1960s, he told her, when the family's money had been simpler and less complicated. His father had extended it, added the east wing, planted the gardens that were probably overgrown now because he had not spent enough time there in the last several years. He said overgrown with the mild guilt of someone who has neglected something they care about. "Your mother," she said. She had not asked about his mother before. "She died when I was 12, he said. She knew what my father's business was, but she had made a decision, early, to live the part of the life that was hers and not examine the rest too closely." He paused. "I don't know if that was wisdom or avoidance. I think it was probably both. Most survival strategies are both." "Yes." He glanced at her. "Your parents?" "Still in Chicago," she said. "My mother calls every Sunday and does not ask about David anymore, which took her 14 months to manage. My father asks about work in a way that's his version of asking about everything else." She paused. "They know I'm here and that I'm... Okay. They don't know the full situation. The full situation being you." She said it simply. "I haven't figured out how to describe you to people who know me from before. To people who knew me as David's wife." He was quiet for a moment. "What would you say?" She thought about this honestly. "I'd say I met someone who is complicated and serious and who looks at me like I'm the most interesting problem in the room and has no interest in solving me." She paused. "I'd say he's younger than me and Korean, and that his history is not simple, and that he told me the truth about it when he didn't have to." She looked at the road. "I'd say he makes me want to stay in the room even when the room is difficult, which is something I didn't know I still had in me." Junha did not respond immediately. The road curved through a valley, and the mountains appeared on the left, dark green against the blue. "That's a good description," he said quietly. "I know," she said. Bob. The estate was at the end of a road that turned to gravel and then to packed earth, set against a hillside with a view of the valley below that the house seemed to have been placed specifically to face. The main building was traditional in its bones, but extended in ways that spoke of different decades and different intentions. The original structure low and careful, the additions larger and less patient. The gardens were, as he had said, overgrown. Not unpleasantly. The kind of overgrown that happens when something has been allowed to grow without direction and has found its own shape. And the shape was, she could see what they had been and what they were becoming. And the space between those two things was full of something she didn't have a precise word for. Persistence, maybe. The insistence of growing things on continuing to grow. They walked through them in the late afternoon and she asked questions, and he answered and she watched him in this place. The specific quality of his body in a landscape that had known him as a child, the way his shoulders were different here, less structured, the way he touched a stone wall with 2 fingers as he passed it, with the absent familiarity of someone who has touched that wall 10,000 times. He showed her the room where he had grown up, small, with a window that faced the mountain, a desk that was still there, wood worn smooth at the edges, a shelf with books in Korean and English, the English ones with the specific soft spines of books read many times. "You read a lot," she said. "I had no siblings and my father was often away," he said. "Books were—" He paused. "Books were a place I could go where the situation was someone else's problem." Besides, she understood that completely and did not say so because some understandings don't need to be stated. On the desk, beside the lamp, there was a small box. Lacquered wood, old, the finish cracked in places at the corners. He picked it up and held it for a moment before he set it flat on the desk between them. "My grandmother's," he said. "She gave it to my father when he married my mother. He gave it to me the year he got sick." He paused. "He told me he was giving it to me because he didn't know what would happen to his life, but he wanted someone to know where this was." She looked at the box. "Open it," he said. She looked at him. "Please," he said. She opened it. Inside, on a bed of worn silk, was a ring. Not large, not ostentatious. A simple gold band with a stone she couldn't immediately name. Deep red, the color of something that had been formed under enormous pressure and had kept the memory of it in its structure. Old. Visibly old, the gold worn at the inner edge in the way that gold wears when it has been on and off a finger for decades. She looked at it for a long time without touching it. "Junha," she said. "I'm not asking you a question right now," he said immediately. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not staging something." He paused, and she heard in the pause a man who had decided to say something real and was taking the time to say it real. "I brought you here because this is the place where I'm most honestly myself. Before the organization, before the decisions, before everything I built and everything I dismantled, this is just the room where I grew up. And this is just the ring that my grandmother wore for 50 years, and that my father kept because he loved my mother, and because he understood by the time he gave it to me that love is not a thing you build. It's a thing you choose and keep choosing against everything that makes it easier to stop." She was looking at the ring. "I chose you," he said. "Not strategically. Not as a calculation about who could survive the room with me. I chose you because you are you. Because you walked into a situation that had nothing to offer you except difficulty, and you stayed in it because you decided to, and because the way you make decisions is the most honest thing I have encountered in 15 years of being surrounded by people who make decisions based on advantage." He stopped. "I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I'm showing you a ring that has been in this box for 3 years because I didn't know what to do with it, and I'm telling you that I know now." She looked at the ring for a long time. She thought about the boardroom in Chicago, about the 12 people who said nothing, about the 19 months of rebuilding, the apartment in Mapogu furnished deliberately and one piece at a time, the color she had put back into the walls of her own life after years of making herself smaller. She thought about what it had cost her to walk through Junha's door at 11 o'clock at night and sit across from Shindai 1 and not calculate the exit. She thought about what it had cost her to open the folder and read what was in it and remain in the room. She thought about David's voice saying replaceable and the 12 people who had said nothing, and she thought about how far she had traveled from that room. Not geographically, not professionally, but in the specific interior territory of knowing what she was worth and refusing to negotiate it downward for the comfort of someone else's ego. She thought about Junha at 22, inheriting something enormous and violent and making decisions that left marks he had spent 15 years living with and 4 years systematically addressing. She thought about a man who had the power to do anything and had chosen, specifically and deliberately, to dismantle the parts of himself that were built on fear. She thought about what that cost, and whether it was the kind of cost you could appreciate if you hadn't paid something similar yourself. She thought about her mother calling every Sunday, and Seoul in April, and the corner table at Bora, and a note on her kitchen table that said, "Routine is armor." She picked up the ring. She did not put it on immediately. She held it in her palm and felt the weight of it, real weight, the specific gravity of old gold, of something that had passed through hands she would never know, and had arrived here, in a room on a hillside outside Seoul, in the palm of a woman who had once believed that the best version of her life was already behind her. She looked at Junha. "I need you to know something," she said. "Tell me." "I'm not easy," she said. "I'm not going to become easier. I will tell you when I think you're wrong, and I will need you to tell me when you think I'm wrong, and I will not always take it gracefully. I have work that matters to me, and I will not make it smaller, and I will not make myself smaller. And there are going to be times when the thing I need is space to think, and not someone managing my reaction to what I'm thinking." "I know," he said, "and I need—" She paused. "I need this to be a thing we choose together, not a thing one of us builds and the other inhabits. Not a structure I'm protected inside of. A thing we both decide." "That's the only version I want," he said. She looked at the ring in her palm for one more moment. Then she put it on her own finger. It fit, not perfectly, slightly loose, the way old rings often are, sized for a hand from a different time. She would have it adjusted. The imprecision felt honest. Very few things of value arrived already fitting perfectly. She looked at her hand with the ring on it. Then she looked at Junha. His face was still composed, as it almost always was, but something behind it was not. Something that had been very carefully held for a long time had released slightly, and the releasing had the quality of something large and private, not for the room, barely for her. She let him have it without comment. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. Deet. The spring passed, and summer came to Seoul the way it always did. Suddenly, with humidity and light, and the city in full noise, the parks full, and the Han River walked every evening by people in the particular determined leisure of a population that worked very hard and had decided to also live very deliberately. Imani's practice continued. The Hanso engagement concluded 6 weeks after it resumed, successfully, with a recommendation structure that Choi Byung-il's board adopted with minor modifications, and that she would cite in future proposals as a case study in organizational resilience. Ha-Yun came on full-time. A second junior consultant, a young Korean-American woman named Grace, who had the specific focused intelligence of someone who had spent years being underestimated and had stopped letting it slow her, joined in June. The Kang corporate group moved through the final stages of its restructuring into a form that was, if not entirely without complexity, at least entirely without the layers of informal arrangement that had made it what it was for 30 years. There were losses in that transition. 3 long-term business relationships ended because they could not survive the move into legitimate structure. One ended badly enough that Junha spent 2 weeks managing a situation that he came home from each evening looking like a man who had made a decision he stood behind completely and was paying for without complaint. She did not ask him to talk about it on the evenings when he was not ready to talk. She made dinner, or they ordered food, or she worked at the other end of the table while he sat with whatever it was until it was small enough to set down. She understood from her own history that some weights were not lessened by being spoken aloud. They were lessened by being carried long enough that you developed the strength to carry them, and the development was interior and could not be rushed. He was there on the mornings when she was working through something she couldn't yet articulate. The proposal that wasn't landing right. The client situation that had a quality she hadn't identified yet. He made coffee and did not fill the silence, and was present in the specific way that presence is most valuable. Not performing attention, just there. They had learned the geography of each other. Not completely. She did not think you ever learned anyone completely, and she was suspicious of the idea that completion was the goal. But enough. The specific enough of 2 people who have seen each other in the worst available light and decided to remain. Whoosh. In September, they went back to the estate. The gardens had been attended to over the summer. He had sent someone, had overseen the work remotely, and the result was not manicured but managed. The overgrowth cleared to reveal the original design, which was more beautiful than she had imagined it when she had seen it wild. The bones of it were good. Someone had planted it decades ago with real intention, and the intention had survived the neglect. They walked through it in the September evening, the air cooler now, the light at the angle it reached in autumn, and she was wearing the ring, which she had had adjusted and which now fit exactly, and she was thinking about something she had been thinking about for several weeks. "I want to tell you something," she said. He stopped walking and looked at her. "The apartment in Mapogu," she said. "I've been there 3 years. I furnished it deliberately and I love it, and it's mine in a way that felt very important for a very specific period of my life." He waited. "I don't want to be somewhere that feels like it's only mine anymore," she said. "I want to be somewhere that's ours. If that's—" she paused. "If that's something you want." He looked at her for a long moment. In the September evening light, in the garden his grandmother had planted and his father had extended, and that had grown its own shape during the years of neglect, he looked at her with the specific expression she had seen in the hotel room in Hanam Dong when she had put the ring on her own finger, the one that was too private to be held too long. "Yes," he said, "that's something I want." "I'm not moving into your apartment," she said. "We find something together." "Of course." "And I want a separate office space, not a home office, a space that's mine." "Obviously. And I'll need Amani." His voice was quiet and precise. "Yes, to all of it." She held his gaze. "You don't know what all of it is yet," she said. "No," he agreed, "but I know you, and I know that whatever all of it is, it will be specific and considered and non-negotiable, and I will agree with most of it, and we'll discuss the parts I don't, and arrive at something workable." He paused. "That's how we do things." She looked at him for a moment. Then she started walking again, back toward the house, and he fell into step beside her, and they walked through the garden in the September evening, not talking, the specific silence of two people who have arrived somewhere after a long and difficult route and are, for the moment, simply here. The mountains were dark against the dimming sky. The valley below held the last of the light. In the main house, someone, the caretaker, an older man named Song, who had worked for the Kong family for 20 years, had turned on the lamps, and the windows of the house were warm yellow against the growing dark. She thought about David's voice, replaceable. The 12 people who said nothing, the particular cold of that morning in Chicago, which had been, she understood now, not the ending of something, but the first moment of something else, the moment the direction changed, even if the change had taken years to declare itself fully. She thought about the corner table at Bora and the spilled coffee, and a man who had looked at her ruined morning and said, "I remember things that matter." She thought about a folder of documents she had opened, knowing the weight of what was in it, and a rooftop above Mapogu in the March cold, and a hotel room in Yongu, and a ring that had been in a lacquered box for 3 years waiting for someone its owner had not yet met. She thought about what it meant to rebuild a life not once but twice, the first time out of necessity, the second time out of choice, and how the second time was harder in every way except the one that mattered. The second time, she had known what she was building toward. Beside her, Junha walked in the particular steady way he moved through every room and every situation, not without awareness of the weight of things, but not diminished by it either. A man who had inherited violence and had spent 15 years making something different out of it, not because someone asked him to, but because he had looked at what he had and decided it was not what he wanted to be. She understood that. She had done something similar, in her own register, in her own rooms. They were not the same. They were not without difficulty. The months ahead would have their own requirements, their own costs, their own mornings where the ground was less certain than either of them would prefer. She knew this with the specific clarity of a woman who had stopped expecting certainty and had started instead building the kind of foundation that could hold in uncertain conditions. She reached out and took his hand, not dramatically, not as a declaration for anyone watching because no one was watching, just the caretaker behind the lit windows and the dark mountains and the last September light over the valley. Just the specific, honest gesture of a person choosing, in the full knowledge of what the choice meant and what it had already cost and what it would still require to hold on. He held back. And they walked into the house together, into the warm lamplight, into the beginning of whatever the next thing was going to be. Not easy, not certain, not clean, but theirs, in the specific and irreplaceable way that only things you have fought for and chosen and paid for honestly can ever be.